All right, so we'll strive to get started. We're running a couple of minutes late. I will try and not keep you because I know that impacts your lunch, and I'm the only thing standing between you and lunch, which is never a comfortable place to be, but it's better than being right after lunch because then you don't, or right before beer at the end of the day. So my name is David Nalley. I'm a recovering sysadmin. I did operations for about a decade. That means that I still know that it's down, not across, and that I still play as a sysadmin, but no one calls me in the middle of the night anymore. I left operations to come work on a project called CloudStack, which is now at the Apache Software Foundation, and essentially that's my full-time job now. I also design very ugly slides. For that, I apologize, but hopefully it won't be too awful. So just going back last year there was a PuppetCamp in LA, and Jason Hancock showed off his CloudStack integration. Is Jason here? He said, there he is. He said he was going to heckle. So Jason worked for a major movie studio, and essentially they had some things that needed to be heavily automated, and it was batch workloads. He talked about that. I'm not going to rehash that. There's a link here, and the slides will be on SlideShare later today. So you can go watch his video. It's great. If you want to see really awesome, large-scale efficiency that is driven by Puppet in an automated infrastructure as a service platform. Quite honestly, it is one of the best stories of using Puppet, and he talks about some of the efficiencies they were able to achieve. I want to say it was you were doing something that you had previously done with a proprietary tool that you did it for 1/16 the cost, and in how much time? Right. So substantial improvements and substantially cheaper, and it was largely hands-off. And they were also able to use their infrastructure as a service platform to play games as well, which is a benefit that is not to be dismissed. So if you're not familiar, Apache CloudStack is an open source infrastructure as a service platform. It's proven in production at massive scale. The largest deployment I am aware of is right at 30,000 physical nodes with virtual machines running atop it. And it's awesome, and I'm not going to sit here and give you a sales pitch on Apache CloudStack. There's a gorgeous UI that you can play around in. There's a decent API as well as EC2 API support, and that's a link to the API documentation. So again, I'm not going to rehash Jason's presentation. I think it's awesome in its own right. If I had been Don, I probably would have put Jason first, telling that story again, and then me, because I've got a little bit different. I'm abstracting yet another layer out from what he did. But essentially, he was handling configuring new instances, new virtual machine instances, once they were initiated by his work scheduling application that would make API calls to bring up a machine. Once they were defined and brought up, he automated the configuration of those with Puppet and had that all integrated into the API calls that his application made. So this was limited to predefined shared nothing instances provisioned by that batch scheduler. And that's awesome. So I really liked his presentation. I liked what he was doing. And then some folks at Edmunds.com wrote a knife plugin for CloudStack. And yes, I know knife is a chef tool and not a Puppet tool, but I'm going to talk about it for just a minute anyway. So this Nice plugin had the ability to define application stacks. So potentially hundreds of nodes that are interrelated, and not only configure them, but actually have them provisioned as part of the tool, because of course Nice is a provisioning tool. And there's a link to their plugin right there. But just to show you a little bit of what it did, they would go out and define, in this case, a Hadoop cluster, and they would define their zookeeper nodes. So they've got 3 of those. They would define their Hadoop master, and then 3 worker nodes. And you can see some of the things they're doing here, like configuring firewall rules, configuring the size of the instance, the operating system, the disk image that's running on it, and then, of course, the roles that are being applied. And so that would allow them to take this code. This is defined as their Hadoop cluster. When they wanted to spin up a Hadoop cluster, they could go do something like nice stack create and call that Hadoop cluster A, and it would automatically define this. And in 5 or 6 minutes, they would have a working Hadoop cluster that all worked together. So I was jealous because as much as I like the folks at Opscode and as much as I like Nice, I'm really a Puppet guy. I've used Puppet at 3 different employers prior to working on CloudStack, and I'm far more comfortable with it than I am with Chef. And there's a lot of folks who were using the Nice plugin to do that kind of thing while using Puppet as their config management tool. So I was really a little jealous. So then I went to FOSDEM last year. And so this CloudStack user who works for a large European mapping company says, hey, we're using CloudStack. And we were looking at CloudStack and Open Nebula, and we saw this this work that some of the guys at Puppet Labs did. And so Ken Barber wrote essentially types and resources for Open Nebula, and he did that, I want to say, that blog post is dated early 2012, so I'm guessing that's probably January. And essentially it allows them to define their actual, their VMs, their real infrastructure as in Puppet manifests. And so, of course, this large mapping company said, we really want this awesomeness for CloudStack. So walked away from that. And, of course, the reason they want it is they want to be able to define all of their infrastructure. So when we think of Puppet, the general way that you go about thinking about it is that you have a machine that you want Puppet to configure. And we talk about that as infrastructure as code. But it requires that you have those machines already provisioned. It requires that you have things like Puppet installed, and then you're handling the configuration on the machine. It's not a larger sense of configuring the entire infrastructure, and this allows you to escape and abstract that away so that you can specify, my ERP instance is this app server on one machine connected to this database on another machine, and with a load balancer in front of it that's HA proxy, and it's configured this way. And that is our application stack. And when I deploy it, I want the machines that go behind it to be deployed as well. So it's really almost getting into the automated provisioning side of things. And it's using infrastructure as a service to do that. So then at PuppetCamp, Dan Bodie was showing off types and resources for Google Compute Engine. And apparently this is the 3rd iteration that they had done, trying to essentially do infrastructure as a service. So I want to say Dan said the first was Puppet Cloud Provisioner that they tried to use for a while. They did the Open Nebula work, and then Dan did the Google Compute Engine work. So essentially, you can define what you want your infrastructure to look like within Google Compute Engine, and it will provision all of the machines. And then, of course, Puppet will handle the configuration on machine. So you can see that presentation there. In the meantime, I had been trying to buy Dan lots of alcohol and convince him that this was something we really needed for CloudStack. So for Christmas, Dan wrote types and providers for CloudStack. And you can see it's still in his GitHub account, that repo there. So let's talk about a little bit how it works. So effectively, you can define an instance, right? So of course, you want to ensure that the instance exists. You want to specify how large the instance is as far as resources and CPU and memory. And those are typically referred to as flavors or service offerings. And these are actually defined in your infrastructure as a service platform. So in this case, a small instance might be 1 gigahertz and 512 of RAM, but it's arbitrary and it relates to something that the cloud management platform knows. So then you also have zone. So you want to specify what is effectively the availability zone. Do you want it in US East? Do you want it in a data center in San Jose? And so you're telling it where to deploy it, how big to deploy it, the disk image that should be installed on it, and then the network, because you could have n number of networks. You could also specify the domain if you wanted to create it for accounts other than your own, if you had permissions to do that, and of course the host name. So essentially, you're defining what the machine looks like, and if you compare this to how you would provision something else, rather than going out and making the API call to EC2 or even to CloudStack itself, this essentially allows you to define what a machine looks like from a physical resources, or virtual resources in this case, standpoint, and to deploy that. And hang on, so a couple of more things. So we're going to I've left out some items, and we'll talk about how they are defined by defaults in a minute. But essentially setting the role so that when that machine comes up, it's going to be a CloudStack instance. It's going to get provisioned, but when it comes up, it's going to have that group, which will end up being a fact in that is accessible to it, essentially building on the work that Jason did for how he was setting configuration on the machine. He was using facts to he was setting a fact on the machine based upon what CloudStack had been told about its role. And so this is setting that so that it can be a fact and that it can be consumed by factor and then reported, which will then handle what's going to happen when it gets configured. So you have the various different pieces there that will automatically tell the machine what facts it's going to present to Puppet. Puppet will use those to configure it as a database server or an Apache web server. And so instead of calling each one of these or provisioning them manually, if you wanted to spin up a new test deployment of your web stack, or a production deployment for that matter, you would just call back to that class. Lost anyone? This is still hopefully interesting, but still simple enough. So we can also set defaults, right? So we can define that our default image is going to be CentOS 6.3 or Ubuntu 12.04. We can define our service offering to be M1 Medium or whatever else, so that instead of having to specify those, they can automatically be deployed. Setting key pairs, setting networks. I don't think Dan has finished all of the firewall and load balancing things, so those aren't specified yet. That's something that I hope to finish up. And that makes, defining a single instance to be 4 lines of code in a manifest, which means that you really can move your infrastructure to be completely code. And again, I'm showing this with CloudStack. You could do this with Google Compute Engine and Open Nebula as well. There is, I understand it's relatively unmaintained, there's an EC2 types and resources as well. But that effectively allows you to completely document what your infrastructure looks like. I have 15 machines. They have this much RAM each. They have, they're on this network, and just deploy that quite easily, which makes spinning up an entire test infrastructure very easy. So I'd encourage you to go grab that from Dan, play with it. He's got a presentation where he talks about doing this as well. And I'm happy to answer questions if you want to talk, or if you want to go to lunch, I will not be offended. So, yes.
Does Dan's provider, do they work across CloudStack instances? If I want to launch up these data pipes and launch it on my...
So, yes, but you would essentially have to define different, rather than calling CloudStack instance, it would be data pipe instance. So you would, because you're going to have to configure your creds and the API endpoint separately. So CloudStack instance assumes an endpoint and API and secret key creds. Yes.
So this is Puppet managing your cloud infrastructure. How would you compare this? This is obviously new. This is CloudStack. How about OpenStack? Is there something analogous, or it hasn't been done yet?
It hasn't been done yet. So CloudStack actually predates OpenStack by about 2 years. So it's both Open Nebula was the first CMP, and they were, I want to say they started in 2007. CloudStack started in 2008, and OpenStack's a relative newcomer in 2010. So Yucca was around in 2008 as well. Yes.
So where does that actually run, since it's not running on a machine?
So typically you would do this on the Puppet master. You could also just run it on the sysadmin's machine, and it would be making the API calls out from there. But I think the intent is that it would sit on the Puppet master. Yeah. So obviously this is not running on the CloudStack infrastructure, which you may not even have shell access into, right? Anything else I can answer? Outstanding. Thanks very much. Enjoy lunch.